Hello and welcome to the Quantical podcast, where we invite experts from across the industry to discuss relevant and topical issues. My name is George and I am your host. And in this episode, I am delighted to be talking to Richard Parkin, who is Head of Retirement at BNY Mellon. And we will be talking about retirement in light of the recent FCA review.
Good morning, Richard. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this podcast. And I just thought it would be worth just giving some context to where we are today. The state pension apparently first came into place in 1909 with a retirement age of 70 when the life expectancy was 52. And then in 1928, it was made universal for everyone. And that was at an age of 65 when the life expectancy was 59. If we now fast forward, the life expectancy is 80 and retirement age is 60 to 67, although on average, most people hope to retire around 62. So it's really fascinating to see how the landscape has changed and just talk to Richard today to really understand what he's doing and how he's thinking about it. So I'd just like to start with the first question, really, which is really to have some introduction to who Richard is and his career and his role and what really wakes him up in the morning.
Yeah, thanks, George, and thanks for the opportunity to take part in this podcast. So I've been around in pensions and retirement for longer than I care to mention, probably over 35 years now. Most of my career, initially at least, was in defined contribution pensions. So we were pioneering the introduction of defined contribution pensions into the UK in the 1990s. And I spent a good chunk of my career at Fidelity helping build the DC business there. And then in 2013, I was asked to take a bit of a change in direction, which was to look after the retirement offering for Fidelity across the UK. So not just their workplace pensions, but their direct-to-consumer and their advisor business. And I must admit, when I was first offered the job, I wasn't madly keen because there wasn't, whilst retirement was growing, there was no real sort of catalyst for it to grow very quickly, whereas the DC business was going very strongly. But I took the role, and then 6 months later, George Osborne announced pension freedom, which just completely changed what we were doing, changed the environment. And so I've been focused on retirement since that time. And it's in terms of what gets me out of bed, the thing I love about focusing on this end of people's sort of pension saving is that you get to see the effects of what you do. So building DC is great, and you hope that you've built products and services that will serve people to deliver them pensions in the future. But many of the people that I put those products in place for, I won't be around to see how they do. Whereas with retirement clients, the help and support that advisors give their clients, it translates into sort of real things happening here and now, and it's great to be a part of that, and particularly given how much is going on in this space. That's such an exciting sector to be in.
When you talk about DC, I come from a background of, I think the first time I ever came across pensions was in something called the final salary schemes, which are guaranteed. And if you were in one of those, you were very, very fortunate, is that, you came to retirement and you knew exactly what you were going to get. Defined contributions are different because you just put some money into a pot and you hope that it's going to give you something when you come to retirement. It's quite unusual in my mind for an investment house to focus on retirement. You would expect an insurance company to deliver products into retirement. So why is BNY Mellon so focused on retirement? Why don't you just leave it for an insurance company to do that for you?
No, okay, well that's great. I think that's an association a number of people might make, and actually my role as sort of head of retirement for an asset manager is still relatively unique. The reason we're focusing on it so much is that it's a huge part of the advisor market. I used to, before joining BMI, I ran my own consultancy, and together with Next Wealth, we used to do an annual survey of retirement advice. And we consistently found that retirement assets made up so between 55 and 60% of advisors' total assets under advice, and therefore probably make up an even bigger part of the revenue. So it's a very important part of advisor business, and of course, it's really important to the advice clients. Getting this right is, fundamental to people actually being able to enjoy the fruits of, many years of work and saving. So it's important for clients and for their advisors. It's complex, right? Trying to work out what the best approach for helping somebody achieve a sort of sustainable income in retirement is always complex, because there's so many uncertainties. You talk to yourself about the fact that people retiring today at maybe 62, potentially going to live for at least another 20 years. A lot can happen in that time. So you're going in not really knowing what the future is going to throw at you. Actually, you don't even know how long your client's going to live, right? So trying to work that out, and I would argue that the environment for retirement advice just got even more complex and even more challenging. And the final reason is that it's risky. One of the things that makes retirement advice so attractive for advisors is you're generally dealing with people with larger amounts of money. It can be very rewarding. It can be very both sort of intellectually, but also financially. But the problem is, if you get it wrong, it can cost an awful lot of money to put it right. And we saw that with some of the challenges we had around DB transfers. So I think for all of those reasons, it's an area advisors have got to make sure they really kind of focus in on. And our philosophy is, we've got a lot of people in this building who really understand about managing risk and managing investments and how to get the best out of them, both in the UK and globally. And it is so what we're trying to do is say, right, how can we bring all of that expertise and insight to bear in helping retirement advisors meet the challenge of giving good advice for their clients.
So the FCA have got this review on retirement income that has come out, and I know that for a lot of financial planners, advisors, that it's quite a challenge, in that there's a lot of legislation coming out at the moment. And so I guess for some of them, it feels like it's just another piece of legislation. So I guess the question is that why have they done this? Why have they produced this review? And what is it trying to achieve?
Sure. Yes. So I totally sympathise with the idea that advisors are being hit left, right, and centre with change. And Consumer Duty is still kind of working its way through. But I think it's very helpful to think of the Retirement Income Advice Review as sort of a clarification of some of the FCA's expectations in the area of retirement advice. And indeed, one of the reasons that they wanted to do the review was to look at how advisors were implementing the Consumer Duty, and we'll maybe talk about that a bit more. But their fundamental reason was just recognizing that post-pension freedom, a lot more people have been using investment solutions. The FCA says, look, we recognize that you need advice for those, but we also think it's a pretty complex area. So what they wanted to do was have a look at the advice that had been given and understand basically how well that had really taken on board customer needs, and how suitable that advice was. And it's important to note that this is well overdue. So originally it was scheduled for, I think, 2019, and then it got delayed because the FCA were busy, and then COVID happened and it got delayed again. And then it looked like it had been put on the back burner, but those of us who were kind of reasonably close to the FCA knew that there was still kind of beavering away in the background on it. And lo and behold, beginning of 2023, they announced they were going to go ahead with it. And we were supposed to have the results at the end of last year. We didn't actually get them until the 20th of March, but there is certainly a lot in there for advisors to look at. But it's important also to recognise that this was just a thematic review. So whilst there is sort of plenty of sort of guidance and the inevitable Dear CEO letter that's come out of it, these are not new rules. It's sort of clarification of FCA expectations in relation to existing rules.
So pension freedom, when that came out, I'm not sure if it's how accurate this is, because you've always got to be a bit careful when you see things, but up to the point of pension freedom, quite a lot of people doing annuities, and then it seems that seems to have just fallen off a cliff. So less and less people are doing annuities, more and more people are doing drawdowns, so effectively just taking an income from their pension fund. So looking at the findings from this review, can you kind of just go through some of those main findings and also perhaps just touch on what do advisors need to take in terms of action? No, I think that's really important, because I've spoken to some financial advisors and they've sort of said, well, if a client is in an adventurous portfolio, they're going to live for another 20 years. So we'll just leave them in there and we'll just run that through. So it'd be really interesting just to find out, just kind of a headline where you see some of those findings, and then kind of where you think action needs to be taken.
Sure. So the first thing I'd say, if listeners haven't read the findings of the thematic review, then please do. It's actually set out in an incredibly helpful way. One of the challenges we sometimes have with the FCA is that it's not quite clear what they mean, what the expectations are. But they've done a brilliant job here of setting out what the principle is, and then giving examples of good practice and bad practice. And whilst I think we've got a lot of positive stuff in the report, they did find a lot of things, that a lot of areas for improvement, but they've kind of presented that in what I would see as quite a constructive way. So I don't think advisors can say it's not clear what the FCA's expectations are in this area anymore. So it's probably worth sort of starting off by just looking at what the sort of contents of that Dear CEO letter were, and they concentrated on 5 areas. They were setting income withdrawals. There was concern that the income withdrawal approach wasn't based on individual circumstances, or the assumptions that they were based on were not justified or recorded. And I think they witnessed sort of some inconsistency within firms as to sort of what level of income was deemed suitable. Risk profiling, I think, is a really important area, and one we'll maybe come back to in a minute, where they didn't see a lot of differentiation between the way firms were assessing risk for clients in decumulation versus those who are still accumulating wealth. And a key point here, they didn't think there was enough focus on capacity for loss. And maybe just touching on that point about leaving the client in an adventurous portfolio, there's clients will still need to take risk, but it's just perhaps thinking of what can happen in the extreme circumstances. 2022 was a bit of a wake-up call for people, and we hope we won't see that too often, but I think it just reminded people that what can sometimes look like reasonably sort of low risk can have a nasty sting in the tail. The other points that were in that Dear CEO letter: fact finding. Just FCA didn't think that in all cases firms had captured enough information on assets and expenditure and future objectives, and income needs to really demonstrate the suitability of advice. And then the one we sort of had a bit of a trail about, and this is sort of more of an industry wide issue, about ongoing advice and whether clients who are paying for ongoing advice had really received a periodic review, and in particular that periodic review was a review of ongoing suitability rather than just a sort of quick update on how the portfolio was going. And then the final point, number 5 in that Dear CEO letter, was just some comments around inaccurate or insufficient record keeping, to be able to really kind of sort of track outcomes and track delivery of the periodic reviews. And I think that last one kind of came up because of the FCA's finding that not all advisors were able to respond to their questionnaire in quite as fully as they hoped. So you asked what will advisors need to do. There's quite a lot. I think specifically what the FCA are doing is saying, look, read the Dear CEO letter, make sure that you understand what we're saying in these key areas, and think about your own business and how you measure up to those. And as I said, the actual findings document give you a really good kind of blueprint of good good and less good practice against a number of objectives. So that's really helpful. They've also provided a sort of spreadsheet which allows you to do sort of a file check. So it's the spreadsheet that they used when they were doing the file checks for the thematic review, and suggesting you could use that within your firm to see how you measure up. They've also suggested, particularly in relation to that control framework point, looking at the questionnaire that was sent out and just asking yourself, could we have answered this questionnaire? Or if you did answer it in the original data collection exercise, where did you have challenges, and how can you improve record keeping to make sure you can respond to that in the future? And then finally, there was a very helpful note on cash flow planning and some of the FCA's expectations around that was put out alongside that. So firms would do well to have a look at that and just see how their own approach to cash flow planning stacks up. So lots and lots to go after there, and probably we can break some of that down over the rest of the podcast.
So clearly advisors need to take action. And I think there are two things that, I mean, there's a lot that I could ask you about on this, but there were two things that kind of struck me as you were talking. One is the risk profile and that capacity for loss, which I guess ties in with that example of, it's very easy to say, I'm 60, I've got 20 years to go until I'm 80. So why wouldn't I want to invest in the same way as I have for the last 20 years? So I think it'd be really good to try and unpack that a little bit. And I think the other thing, just touching at the end, was about this whole cash flow modeling. And I guess to explain to, most people who are listening to this, you would hope would understand what cash flow modeling is. But I guess it's become a bit of a tool for some financial planners to say, actually, this is how we add value. But I guess the question is a business, because different people will use it different ways. So it'd be really good if you could just unpack those 2 points.
Yeah, let me start with the cash flow planning, because obviously the risk and investment piece is kind of really fundamental to where we are. So so the cash flow planning, I think I mentioned the research I used to do with Next Wealth before. I mean, we always found that the use of cash flow planning was incredibly high. It was like 85-90% of firms said, yes, we use cash flow planning for retirement advice. It's just where they use it. If you look at how often they use it, it's certainly not used across all clients. It tended to be used more where, particularly we got things like DB transfers, or where the client was taking out a sort of relatively high level of income relative to their assets, and therefore didn't, maybe didn't have a lot of headroom. And so it's really important to understand where it was. So I think the FCA would like to see more consistent use of cash flow planning across the piece. And I guess there is an argument, and one that is quite fair, is it's very difficult to advise a client what they should be doing today without having some understanding of what the future might look like for them. I do think the FCA, and I see this a lot around the industry, the FCA and others are sometimes maybe being a little unrealistic about how much detail you can get into a plan. And I know, talking to advisors, that just trying to get a client to articulate what they want over the next few years is quite difficult. In fact, I think this is one of the real sort of skills of good financial planners, is how getting clients to think about the future and understanding what that means for them, and then translating that into financial needs. That's a real that's a real skill. It's a real task. But getting much more than 5 years out can get quite tricky. So I think we need to be realistic that you can't build a lifetime financial plan that's going to be super accurate, but you probably need to start somewhere. And I think the other kind of points about cash flow planning is just making sure that it's consistent. One of the big challenge that advisors talk to me about is being able to build an advice process that takes you from sort of initial sort of client objectives through fact finding into sort of cash flow planning, into portfolio construction and sort of scenario testing, and then into implementation and back out to review, which is consistent all the way through. Because you might have a cash flow planner that's running on a certain set of assumptions, but they may be different from your scenario analysis tool, which may then be different from the assumptions that have been assumed in your investment proposition. So And I think it's this sort of inconsistency within the process, and as I said earlier, across individuals within the same firm that the FCA is really concerned about. Yeah, I think they may have been overly optimistic in terms of what can be achieved, but it does seem that they've hit on some reasonable points. Um, so I'll just so I think that's probably what I want to say on cash flow. On this broader point about risk and investment, I mean, it is really challenging. It is an area that we've been very focused on at BNY, and we've actually built a sort of framework around retirement investment, and which really starts of looking at where clients who are taking retirement income are different from those who are saving, and we could talk a bit more about that, but that's all kind of on our website set out how we kind of think about the framework for retirement investing.
And in terms of that investing, I guess one of the greatest challenges is, I think I looked at you've got the website and you talk about the active years pot of where you kind of save and put that all together. And I guess I mean, that's a huge challenge for people now, isn't it? In that, it's not just about your retirement pot. It's actually, how do you get a pot of money that's enough to retire on? And I guess that is all part of how we think about the whole thing, isn't it? Is that, in the past, you there was a group of people who had these defined benefits, DB schemes, where they had guaranteed income. And there still is that, within the civil service, within certain sectors. Do you see that as a really, as much as you are focused on the end bit, the retirement, but the building, do you think that that's going to change over time, how we save for retirement? Do you think that's a challenge for us?
Yeah, no, well, absolutely, and I mean, I think a lot of the retirees who come today many of them will still have a chunk of defined benefit, but it is falling and falling pretty rapidly. I think, and then if you look at what came after defined benefit, the sort of introduction to defined contribution, pre-auto enrollment, a lot of the schemes were paying pretty low rates of contribution. There wasn't a lot of motivation for individuals to pay more. So I think you've got a generation where not only do they not have access to defined benefit, but they probably didn't get great defined contribution either. Now, of course, advisors will tend to focus on those clients who've got sufficient wealth to be able to kind of justify paying the fees. So I'm not sure how much this will be visible for advisors, but certainly more broadly, I think there's a big problem of underpensioning. Auto enrollment will have gone some way to solve that for the generation that comes after, but even that, I think there are some questions about whether that's going to get people to the level of saving. I think there's also some other bits around what you might call so Generation X is going to be 60 for the first time next year. So Generation X starts at 65. So they hit 60 in 2025. And there's some other stuff as well as not perhaps having defined benefit pensions and this sort of maybe low quality DC. They'll probably have multiple pots. They tend to move around more. They will potentially have housing, which is something in their favour. But they may still be paying off some of that debt. So maybe hit retirement with housing debt. So that may mean you need to think more about how you bring housing into the equation. And of course, they were nicknamed the sandwich generation. When they were sort of being this generation of people who were kind of sandwiched between kids who needed a lot more support than perhaps they needed in their lives, and older parents who might need sort of care and so on. Being in that sandwich generation was tough when you were working. It's going to be even tougher when you're in retirement. So I think the whole nature of clients' circumstances is going to change, but I don't think retirement needs are going to change that much. So I think advisors will continue to add value by understanding what clients are trying to achieve from retirement and working out which levers they need to pull to get the client to a good place.
So advisors have been very used to having a centralized investment proposition, and the FCA talk about having a centralized retirement, or there is a lot of talk about this centralized retirement proposition. Do you think, I guess I could take the view of listening to you go, well, you must think, yes, you've got to have a centralized retirement proposition. But what's your feeling around that? I mean, Do the FCA really want that, or could you get away with, as long as you monitor it, as long as you've got some processes in place, do you really need it?
It's really important to understand quite what we mean by centralised retirement proposition, because I think a lot of people will talk about a centralised retirement proposition or a CRP as a different set of investment funds for clients who are taking retirement income, right? I think it's actually a much broader than that. And when we used to do research in the retirement advice sector, we define it as being a consistent approach to retirement advice that is applied across the whole firm. So it doesn't just include the investment part of it. It's about how do you do your fact finding, how do you do your risk assessment, what other tools you're using, cash flow analysis before you even get to that. How do you decide whether clients should be in drawdown versus annuities? So some firms are now referring to it rather than a centralized retirement proposition as a centralized retirement philosophy. And we all recognize that retirement is going to be different for clients because people have very different needs. But what is your sort of consistent approach? And I think that is definitely what the FCA is looking for. Whether you have to call it a centralized retirement philosophy or proposition or whatever, then I don't think the name's important, but being able to demonstrate that you have a consistent approach, so that clients who have similar characteristics get the same outcome, but also different advisors in your firm are getting people to the same outcome. There is no right way to do retirement investment or retirement advice. So there's lots of scope for inconsistency if people are left to their own device. So it's getting a consistent and credible approach is what the FCA really focused on. Taking the second bit about do you need to have different investment funds? So look, I'm not saying yes you do, though a couple of things to note. So the FCA make the point in their profiling that clients who are in taking retirement income face a very different set of risks. They have very different characteristics from clients who are accumulating wealth. Yeah. And they make the point that firms haven't always been as good at recognizing that and assessing that as they could have been. They then say, oh, and you've got to make sure that your investment solutions are specifically designed to meet the needs of the clients that you're making them available to. So they're effectively saying, look, we think retirement clients are different, and we think you've got to fit the investment solution to client needs. Almost implies that you've got to have a different approach to investment for clients in retirement, and that's kind of the logic that we follow. It doesn't mean that you will end up there. I talked to an advisor before Christmas last year who actually ran the same approach across accumulation and decumulation. It was an approach that was very well suited to decumulation. He got maybe a different question was he being a bit too cautious for some of his clients who are accumulating wealth? So I think the key thing is to just get absolutely satisfied that you can demonstrate that whatever solution you're putting in, whether it's a different one or the same as you're using for accumulation, that it meets the specific needs and characteristics of those retirement income clients. So nothing new from the FCA, just reinforcement of some basic suitability principles, but quite a lot for advisors to think about in terms of, well, what is retirement risk and how do you manage that?
And I guess speaking from an advisor perspective, it does feel quite daunting as to where do you start. And I know you talked about framework and kind of the work you've been doing around this. And I guess it's where do you start and how do you build that out? Because again, I talked about annuities and I was talking to someone the other day and they were saying, well, we don't use annuities. And I can see why, because of pension freedom, but that might not be the case for everyone. So where do you start with this and how have you been thinking about it?
So I guess the way that we've constructed the framework, and it's designed to be kind of used by people whether they're building their own portfolios or outsourcing them and assessing them, whether maybe using multi-asset, assessing approaches provided by others. And we start so the framework consists of a set of principles and a set of investment themes that come from those principles, and then what I call the investment stories, the kind of the so what does that actually mean in practice. So I can talk you through kind of each of those. They are on our website if people want to look a bit more. But let's start with the principles. So I tend to focus on the first three of these, and they're all driven by what makes retirement income clients different from those who are accumulating. So the first one is retirement advised clients tend to have very specific objectives. If I'm saving for retirement, I might have a vague idea about when I'm retiring, but really beyond that, it's about maximizing my wealth and getting me to a point that I hope that I might be able to maintain my standard of living at retirement. So pretty vague objectives. I know some may have more specific, but generally pretty broad. When I get to retirement or close to it, I've got a very clear idea of when I want to retire. I've got probably a pretty good idea of how much income I need, at least in the early years, and maybe some specific expenses I've got. I've probably got some thoughts about what I want to leave in terms of legacy, and I'm maybe sort of thinking a bit about what's my sort of emergency fund. So you can define some very specific objectives, and the principle that comes off that sort of difference is that we should be thinking about risk and how we could sort of manage things for clients in terms of the ability, our ability to achieve those objectives for the clients. Yeah. So it's different from just thinking about volatility or other risk measures. We can frame it exactly in terms of, will my client achieve their objectives? If they don't achieve them, how far short of them might they fall? And I think we think that's a really helpful way of thinking it. The second difference between retirement income clients and those who are accumulating wealth is that retirement income clients will generally have lower resilience. And what do I mean by that? If I'm saving for retirement and the markets go against me, I can save more, I can work longer, I can even take more risk perhaps. If I'm in retirement, I may not have any of those levers available to me, right? So generally, I've probably already retired. I can't save more. So the consequence of that, and the principle is that we need to that retirement clients will be much more focused on avoiding losses than they will necessarily on making gains. It's important to continue growing, but I think the pain of losing money becomes much more acute than the joy of making more. And then the third difference is the presence of sequence of returns risk. So listeners will I'm sure be aware that what we mean by sequence of returns risk really means the risk of big losses early in somebody's withdrawal career, but it can it can have an impact at any time, and really the principle that comes off the back of that is we've got to think very carefully about how we manage those losses in the early years to avoid that happening. So those are there are more principles, but those are the three key ones.
So you talk about principles and you talk about thinking differently when we come to investing in retirement. And you also touched on that it doesn't necessarily mean that we change how we invest. So back to what I was saying was about the adventurous client. But there has been some talk about research that was done quite some time ago, and it's a kind of 4% rule. If you take you shouldn't take more than 4% from your drawdown. Kind of thinking about what you're saying is, can you go a little bit more into detail about how we should be thinking about investing in retirement and what those differences are? But also just touching on that 4% rule, because it comes up quite a bit, and some people say, well, it doesn't apply anymore. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
No, look, the 4% rule wasn't wrong, but it's important to recognise it was originally designed by a guy called Bill Bengen in relation to US market returns, US inflation, everything else. So it's generally not been a bad rule of thumb over here. But I think this is the point about they're just making about, retirement clients have some very specific objectives. And so trying to work out, thinking about those objectives, thinking about the ability to deliver those. And often those objectives are a bit more complex than just paying somebody 4% income a year, right? Because people have variable income needs. You talked right to the top of the podcast about how retirement has changed. One of the other big changes is a lot of people, particularly wealthy people, will not just retire on one day. It's a transition. So, getting that right sort of balance of money from employment versus savings and eventually from state and other pensions is where a lot of the complexity of retirement advice comes in. So I'd just say the 4% rule is probably be too crude. We do think this idea of thinking about risk in terms of objectives lends itself very well to things like cash flow planning and scenario analysis. But the other thing that so one of the implications of the principles, we've got these sort of investment themes we talk about a lot. So the first one is balancing risk and return, and we're always balancing risk and return, aren't we? But I think the point we're trying to make here is that if you do your cash flow analysis for a client and it turns out they need 5.5% to achieve their objectives, then you could argue, and I think we'd suggest you need to think very carefully, saying, right, well, my job as an advisor and an investment manager now becomes delivering that 5.5% with as much consistency and certainty as I can for the client so that they can meet those objectives. There's no point me going and chasing a 7% return if one of the consequences I could end up with 3 and the client ends up not getting the retirement they want. So it's thinking differently, and really moving from a sort of a mindset where we think about kind of maximizing wealth to one where we're thinking much more carefully about balancing risk and return. So that's a key theme. And then a big part of that is limiting downside risk. So we touched on sequence of returns risk. 2022 has shown that that's really painful, for clients right at the start of their drawdown career. So thinking about that, not just relying on these sort of stochastic models which say, oh, well, it's 95% certain it's not going to happen, because the problem is if the 1 in 20 event does happen, then you've got a problem, right? So I think a bit more, so the stochastic analysis is great, but also, right, what are those sort of really extreme events and what impact could they have? And I think that's where thinking about things like, not necessarily annuities, but other things that can give you some level of secure income can help manage that and can help sort of limit the really bad impacts of those unexpected events. And then the third sort of theme that we think is really important and will continue to be important is thinking about inflation. So that was kind of the double whammy, or probably one of the legs of the triple whammy we got in 2022, was at the time that portfolios went down, income requirements went up because of inflation, and so keeping an eye on that, thinking about how we build portfolios that can keep pace with inflation over what could be 20, maybe even 30 years is really important. So those are some of the themes that we think are really important to focus on. So think about risk in terms of clients' objectives and how that plays out. Specific focus on downside risk, and then think about how you're keeping pace with inflation.
So just kind of sort of coming towards the end of this, but there's a couple more things I just want to sort of think about as you were saying them. One, we talked a little bit about consumer duty, and I'll start with that question first, really, is that consumer duty, however we view it or look at it, is ultimately about ensuring the right outcomes for the client. And making sure that we can evidence that we're doing that in the right way. Do you feel that theme is listening to you, I feel that theme is coming very much throughout this whole sort of review. How do you see consumer duty and retirement flowing together? How do you see the two working together?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, George. I mean, consumer duty is about getting good outcomes for clients and helping them realise their financial objectives, isn't it? And this is what retirement is all about. It's very much focused on delivering against a specific need, and so understanding that need and really getting under the skin of what the client is trying to achieve is important. Yeah. So just specifically on the consumer duty, one of the things that did surprise me about the review is it was actually pretty light touch there's a chapter on what is expected under the Consumer Duty, but we were kind of thinking some of the language the FCA were using, they were going to sort of go and look at firms and say, right, have you implemented Consumer Duty on retirement income? They actually, which is what they said they were going to do, but then when it came to it, they actually kind of just said, look, we know Consumer Duty wasn't in for most of the period that we did this review, so here's some pointers, right? And they do talk about, you know, understanding client needs, making sure you've assessed risk properly, and particularly thinking about capacity for loss, which, you know, goes to some of the you know, potential harm that could you know, foreseeable harms that could come about for consumers. And then of course sort of product suitability, value from ongoing advice. So all of these things, you're right, do kind of fit into a Consumer Duty framework. And in fact, I think most of the way the FCA is going to go now will be constantly referring back to that framework. So it does fit in very well. But I would encourage firms to read the thematic review findings and look, so get into much more specific detail about objectives that the FCA is trying to think are important, and then what good and bad looks like to those. So yes, it is consistent with the Consumer Duty framework, but really the way you're going to make sure you're delivering that is to look at these specific things that the FCA are setting out and look at how you're doing against those.
Thank you. And the second point that I just want to cover, as I was listening to you previously, in my previous role, I was managing portfolios for a financial planning practice. And I wonder whether that is becoming more complicated for financial planners to do. I mean, we were a small practice there were 3 of us. And so there was all the research, making sure we had the right funds, and we used active funds. We didn't use index funds. And I guess that this kind of highlights that financial planners are really there to help clients, and it's often very complicated issues. So how do financial advisors who have always loved managing investments suddenly come up with something like this that does require them to do a lot of work? So how did you feel about that side of things?
In terms of what advice, I mean, I think there is a lot of thinking to be done here, and we know that some of the issues involved advisors are finding quite challenging. You know, some other research we did recently said that, you know, the understanding some of the sort of complexity here was something that was stopping advisors from making those changes. But I guess, you know, firms like Qual, firms like you know, ourselves are out there trying to, you know, help firms to work through that process. I mean, whether firms do carry on building their own portfolios or outsourcing to DFMs or using multi-asset, I think that is a sort of a broader question about what sort of capabilities they've got. I do think there is a broader point there, and one that some of the forward-looking firms are thinking about. It's just recognizing where the real value comes from in retirement advice, right? So the real value, I think, is being able to help a client build a plan and then guiding them through that plan year after year, regardless of what the world throws at us. And you know, the problem with kind of pinning your credentials on being able to build a fantastic investment portfolio is that, you know, markets sometimes conspire against you. You won't always. So it's about how do you build something that is you know, good quality, is delivering against the client need, but then helping kind of make sure that is going to work for the client in a range of circumstances. So it's really kind of relating that investment back to the plan. And I think that's the bit where whoever's doing the investment, advisors can't get away from that. They've got to know that, and I think this is something that's really crucial about retirement, is the interaction between withdrawals and investment returns and how it works. You know, whether you're doing the investment yourself or not, understanding how that plays out is really important.
Thank you. I think, you know, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think understanding the value of the whole piece is so important, isn't it? Is that, you know, if you are able to manage the portfolios yourself, then that's fantastic. But equally, you know, I think the true value from a financial planner does come from that expertise. And I guess, when you have things like this retirement review, thematic review, it just shows how important that is. And it's not to say that advisors can't manage investments, because I come from that background. So it's just trying to work out where that value comes from. So as we kind of come to the end of this, and I thank you so much for your time, because it's been fascinating just to listen. And even even myself coming away from this, there's just so much that I think, there's just a lot to do and think about. What would you say that advisors should do next? Because I think it's very easy to go, actually, it's just too much. And so what would your words of wisdom be?
Well, so I kind of go back to where we came on. I think going back and looking at the FCA's review, and it is very well laid out. And I do, I know sometimes people get frustrated with the regulator, but I think on this occasion they've really nailed it in terms of the way they've laid out the expectations. And there is a lot to do there, but if you take it sort of objective by objective, you can work through and deal with it. And there may be some complications that you might need to get some help on, whether that's from investment firms like Qual. But the thing that is happening, there's a real conversation in the industry about how we solve for some of this. How we think about it. And you've got the advisor support firms are all very focused on it. So I think there's a lot of people out there thinking about it. So I read the thematic review, understand the areas that you've got to focus on, work out, do a little sort of check to see where you stack up, and then find those areas where you think you might need to do a bit of work, reach out to get some help, because I'm sure you'll find there's plenty of people out there who are willing to support.
Thank you so much for all that insight today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
It's been a delight to take part. Thanks, George.
Thank you for listening to our latest podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to share this to anyone you feel may be interested. For further information about us, please visit our website, quantqual.co.uk, or my own website, which is money-wise.uk.